Welcome everyone to our EPS Speakers Series at the University of Wisconsin. I'm Erica Turner. I'm an associate professor here, and I'm really pleased today to welcome you to this event and to be able to be in community hearing from Professor Roseann Liu. I want to start by acknowledging that the University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land. It's a place that their nation has called Dejup since time immemorial. And in the 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory, and decades of ethnic cleansing have followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation today. UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. Colonialism we recognize as an ongoing process, and as a department, we recognize and respect the knowledge reflected in the Ho-Chunk stewardship of Tijup and of their continuing connection to land, water, and community at UW-Madison. We recognize the violence, displacement, and settlement that shape our relations in and with this space. And we must therefore, as a department committed to justice, commit ourselves to addressing the intentional erasure of Indigenous peoples in our policies, practices, teaching, and learning, and in our relationships to place and with the earth. We encourage all members of the EPS and SOE communities to trace, celebrate, and deepen their own connections to Dejup and to learn about the histories and present stories of the resilient Ho-Chunk presence and relationships that shape Dejup. I'd like to introduce you all to Roseann Liu, our guest for today. Roseann is an assistant professor of education studies and of Asian American studies at Swarthmore College. She's a scholar of race, education, inequality, and social justice. She's received many notable awards in our field, including the National Academy of Education Spencer Foundation fellowships and the American Educational Research Association Awards and the Wenner-Gren Foundation Award Fellowship. She's a New Yorker by birth and by public schooling, and a teacher there, and now in Philadelphia has continued work in education and advocacy for educational equity and understanding people's everyday experiences in that. And we are honored to have her here today to talk about her recently published book, Designed to Fail: Why Racial Equity in School Funding is So Hard to Achieve. Welcome, Roseann.
Thank you so much. So good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm thank you to you, Erica, and also to Leslie Bartlett and Michael Dixon for arranging this. I was just saying earlier to them that everyone I've ever met from your institution I've really liked, so I appreciate this invitation, and I look forward to our discussion at the end. Yeah, and it's just an honor to really be able to share my work with people whose work I really hold in high regard. All right, so let's get started. In 2016, a study revealed racial bias in Pennsylvania's school funding system. One education advocate indignantly proclaimed that it was, quote, a textbook example of structural racism. The findings demonstrated that the whiter the school district, the more state funding it received relative to its fair share, and the more Black and Brown students in a school district, the less state funding it received relative to its fair share when controlled for poverty and other factors. I call the phenomenon captured in these statistics white district privilege. And so while quantitative analyses like this tell us that there are indeed racial disparities in school funding, why do these statistics still exist in 2023? So my book tells the story behind the numbers, asking and answering the question, why is racial equity in school funding so hard to achieve? So as I wrote the book, one of the audiences I had in mind were people who, like me and like many of the undergraduates I teach, care about issues of race and school funding, but find the weeds of education policy a little less than scintillating. I also had in mind a friend who cares about equity, but also finds Atlantic articles too long and boring. And so I knew that I would have to write the most salacious and gossipy version of school funding possible. And so, I really tried to write a book that was kind of the People magazine of school funding. Okay. So at its heart, this is a story about how people in positions of power wield their power, their structural power to maintain the racial school funding status quo, and how community organizers sought to contest that. And my hope is that by keeping that narrative through line in view, the details will be less of a slog. And so, to answer the question of why racial equity in school funding is so hard to achieve, I turn to critical race theory as a framework for understanding how school funding is dispersed in ways that align remarkably with US and global racial hierarchies. Instead of viewing racism as an individual or interpersonal problem, critical race theorists have shown how racism is so deeply embedded in laws and policies that these systems reproduce racial hierarchy. And so, what this perspective brings into relief is that the policy structures and ideologies that uphold the racial school funding status quo. And indeed, the main policy that perpetuated racial disparities in school funding in Pennsylvania was facially neutral and didn't mention race at all. And similarly, racial animus is not how I would characterize the actions of school funding advocates. Instead, it was the practice of colorblindness that enabled white district privilege. And as Cheryl Harris has noted, colorblindness is a form of race subordination in that it denies the historical context of white domination and Black subordination. I also draw on Harris's concept of whiteness as property to elucidate the dynamic in which legal entitlements protect white privilege. Property is not always tangible, but can be intangible, as in the notion of intellectual property. Quoting Bentham, Harris explains that property is nothing but the basis of expectation that one can draw such and such advantage from the thing possessed. She argued that the law, quote, recognized and protected expectations grounded in white privilege. Whiteness became a type of property that was protected by the legal system and that conferred to its owners a set of settled expectations and benefits. It is, quote, the legal legitimation of expectations and power and control that enshrine the status quo as a neutral baseline while masking the maintenance of white privilege and domination. The book draws on fieldwork and interviews with PA state legislators and members of school funding campaigns. And I think it's worth mentioning here that there were significant power differentials between the people who I worked with in terms of their access to levers of power, with state legislators being at the top and grassroots organizers being at the bottom. I navigated this through practicing a mode of thick solidarity when I encountered competing perspectives between research participants. I assess the power and positionality of different people, and though I tried my best to contextualize everyone's perspectives, I tended to align with the perspectives of those who have been historically marginalized and are, according to grassroots organizers, quote, closest to the pain. Thick solidarity as methodology also allowed me to draw from my experiences, but to mobilize empathy in ways that do not gloss over difference, but rather pushes into the specificity, the irreducibility, and incommensurability of racialized and otherwise experiences. And so I'm glad that Erica actually mentioned that I was a New York City public school teacher. And so I did graduate from the New York City schools and was a teacher. And now I'm currently a parent in the Philly public school system, and I'm a woman of color. But I've never had an experience in which the school that I was in or my children were in was so starved of resources that there weren't enough books for students, as a parent testified to in Pennsylvania's landmark school funding trial. And so lastly, I identify as Asian American, but the vast majority of students most directly impacted by underfunding are Latinx and Black. So as Sadia Garcia tweeted, thick solidarity counters the impetus for thick description, giving new language to ways of being in ethical relation with those we share space with in the field. And so the remainder of this presentation will be broken up into two parts. The first part will mainly focus on state legislators, and then the second half on members of the school funding campaigns. As Rochelle sat at my kitchen island, she registered her moral indignation with the Pennsylvania school funding policy known as Hold Harmless. That day, she and a friend came over to brainstorm ways that I could be involved in Power, a grassroots organizing group Rochelle belongs to, which is committed to eliminating racial bias in the state's allocation of school funding. Rochelle is a beloved elder in the progressive education community in Philadelphia, continuing a legacy of community activism passed down through her mother, Mamie Nichols, a matriarch of South Philadelphia, who has been honored through affordable housing units named after her, and this mural in Point Breeze that bears her likeness. Rochelle's Philadelphia roots run deep. She and her husband raised two children in Philadelphia, and their grandchildren are fifth-generation Philadelphians. She told me that Representative Rabb's new bill proposed what Power had been calling for all along, which is abolishing hold harmless. In Rochelle's estimation, hold harmless was a complete misnomer because it inflicted significant harm on majority-minority urban school districts like Philadelphia. She told me how she recently explained to her husband that hold harmless is the main mechanism for maintaining racial disparities in state funding. Summoning his incredulity, she reenacted his response, spitting out the words hold harmless like it was yesterday's coffee. Finishing her story, she said, "There's no hold harmless when there's already harm done." So to understand the most damaging effects of the hold harmless policy, we have to go back to the 1990s. Rather than distributing state aid dynamically according to a district's changing student enrollment, the policy guarantees that school districts receive at least as much as they receive during a baseline year, regardless of increases or decreases to student enrollment. So because most of Pennsylvania's education aid to school districts is based on an outdated population data from 1991, this method of distributing state aid doesn't recognize the growing financial needs of school districts with rising student populations. And so while this benefits white rural districts that have seen declines in their student population since the 1990s by maintaining their funding levels, hence the term hold harmless, it comes at a significant cost to majority-minority urban districts, many of which have experienced growth in student enrollment since the 1990s, but have not seen an increase in their revenues to reflect that growing enrollment. The policy has been redubbed Hold Harmful by Power members because of the considerable harm it has caused majority Black and Latinx school districts across the state, a discursive move that I adopt here. State legislators adamantly protected hold harmful based on a belief that is the neutral baseline, to borrow Cheryl Harris's phrase, for white districts to have more than majority-minority urban school districts. And though it was never explicitly stated as such, the mere notion that redistributing state funding in a more equitable way that would benefit Black and Brown districts was seen as anathema to state legislators, especially Republicans. Even their use of the term hold harmless reveals how the material well-being of white rural districts are privileged within policymaking considerations. The policy can only be considered, quote, harmless when viewed from the perspective of white rural districts. These racial biases aren't manifested in the form of racial animus, but rather through state legislators' defense of hold harmless at all costs, including its cost to Black and Brown urban school districts. In 2016, the Basic Education Funding Commission, an ad hoc committee in the state legislature, adopted a number of factors that are meant to make the distribution of funding more fair. And this is a list right here of the different factors that they use. And this gave rise to the formula being referred to colloquially as the fair funding formula. So although they adopted the fair funding formula, lawmakers created an asterisk in the law by only applying the formula to new money, that is, increases to the state education budget. As many observers have noted, an equitable formula is only as good as the money you actually send through it. So in 2019 to 2020, since new money only accounted for about 10% of this total state education budget, only 10% of state education aid was distributed in a racially equitable manner. The lion's share of state education funding was distributed through the policy of hold harmful. State lawmakers largely nullified the effects of the fair funding formula through creating an asterisk in the law. The formal status of having an equitable formula did little to improve the actual conditions for Black and Latinx students. So despite the technical fact of a fair funding formula, the quote, natural fact of white privilege, as Harris puts it, prevailed and dictated the pace of change. So to understand the decision behind the asterisk in the law, that is adopting a fair funding formula that only applied to new money while having the rest of the money distributed through the policy of hold harmful, I spoke with a Democratic staffer named Dan about the very first hearing of the Basic Education Funding Commission. Like many staffers, Dan is a white man of Generation X and dressed in a style of clothing that was birthed in Silicon Valley in the 1980s and given the name business casual. Business casual also captured his affective expression, relaxed but focused, and refreshingly candid in answering my questions. Business casual Dan said during the first hearing of the Basic Education Funding Commission, the opening remarks by Republican Representative Donna Oberlander sealed the fate of school funding in Pennsylvania, making both the preservation of hold harmful and the lack of a funding target foregone conclusions. So this is Dan talking. The very first statement when the commission gathered was, "We are not going to touch hold harmless." That was established very early. That was the first thing that was said. So the idea that we were going to drive all the money through the formula, the House Republicans swatted that away in the very first statement when the commission met. During the hearing that Business Casual Dan referred to in late summer 2014, Representative Donna Oberlander opened the proceedings. A profile of her district shed light on why she was chosen to stand in for the chair. In 2019 to 2020, 8 out of her 10 school districts were, quote, winners in the game of school funding, with per student windfalls ranging from $2,000 to $5,700. On average, 96% of the students across her districts are white. More to the point, Representative Oberlander represented districts that were hugely benefiting from hold harmful. By selecting her to open the proceeding and give her perspective, the chair was foreclosing any possibility of eliminating hold harmful. Presiding over the hearing like a judge, Representative Oberlander was steady, resolute, and dispassionate. Lifting her eyes every now and then, she read from her prepared statement. Above all, the goal of the House Republican caucus is fairness for school districts and taxpayers of the Commonwealth. And we all know our basic education funding formulas have, for many years, included what is known as hold harmless to ensure no district receives revenues less than the previous years. The hold harmless is important to many school districts, including my own. Rural districts, like other school districts, serve as community centers. This function is important, but the basic costs of keeping the building open and keeping the lights on are fixed. School districts depend on a stable level of funding to help pay these fixed costs. In a rural district with a limited tax base, state support is needed to help school districts fulfill this vital function for their communities. So while the commission will be examining the hold harmless policy, I will guard against a new formula that hurts districts that have justifiably relied on the hold harmless provision. So to Representative Oberlander, defending the right of her school districts to keep their share of school funding, despite having fewer students to educate, was an issue of, quote, fairness. But the kind of fairness she advocated for is one that comes at the expense of other school districts with increasing student populations, like those serving majority minority students of color in urban schools. Having her majority white districts maintain their collective $34 million windfall was to her fair. Representative Rabb, the Philly-based state lawmaker whose House bill proposed to put 100% of the money through the fair funding formula, said, "If you haven't been operating fairly for generations, what is normal is actually unfair to you." A power organizer conveyed a similar sentiment when he recited this quote, "When you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression." So to be clear, white rural districts were also underfunded, but enjoyed a comparative privilege next to majority minority urban school districts because of the double standard that state legislators like Representative Oberlander applied. To state lawmakers, white rural districts deserve special consideration in the form of hold harmful, but majority minority urban districts did not. Returning to Harris's idea of whiteness as property, as a law, hold harmful, which was protected by Republican commission members and Republican leadership, quote, recognize and protected expectations grounded in white privilege. So Representative Oberlander's defense of hold harmless is indexical of how white district privilege became tantamount to property that could not be permissibly intruded upon without consent, as Harris has said. So if we think of whiteness as property as the settled expectation of keeping $34 million more than your fair share because it's protected by law and because majority white legislators create the laws, then defendants of hold harmful simply see themselves protecting their property and what they are legally entitled to. Privilege allows one to consider one's own constituents and to neglect the policy on others. Oberlander did not mention the effects of hold harmful on districts that have suffered because of this law. Representative democracy gives her an easy out. After all, she was elected to protect the districts of her own majority white, protect the interests of her own majority white constituents who would lose out if the school funding structure changed. Cheryl Harris argues that when the law recognizes the settled expectations of whites, it acknowledges and reinforces a property interest in whiteness that reproduces Black subordination. Hold harmful reinforce the property rights of white students while subordinating the interests of Black and Brown students. So if protecting white district privilege was one part of the equation, then anti-Philadelphia bias was the other. David Hornbeck, a superintendent of Philly schools in the 1990s, is oftentimes remembered for his very public spats with state legislatures over the issue of school funding. So in 1998, staring down the barrel of an $85 million shortfall, Hornbeck pleaded with lawmakers to properly fund Philly schools. His pleas for more funding were ignored, with Governor Ridge's spokesperson commenting, Hornbeck has not successfully focused on the first step of this equation, which is how Philadelphia schools are spending the money they have now. Hornbeck is white, but this comment notably casts aspersions on how Philadelphia schools, which are majority Black, spend their money. The racialized nature of these comments were not lost on Hornbeck, who recalled how state lawmakers analogized giving money to Philadelphia as, quote, sending money down the rat hole. Hornbeck said, and they really did use that kind of language on a routine basis. And in a variation of the term, a number of interviewees that I spoke to told me that lawmakers frequently talked about giving money to Philadelphia schools as putting money down a, quote, black hole. Rather than take aim at the chronic underfunding of schools, comments from the governor's office drew on a long history of stereotyping Black people as spendthrifts as a way to question their ability to self-govern. The state legislature's anti-Philadelphia sentiments experienced by Hornbeck during his superintendency have deep roots and are related to a narrative of scarcity that encourages racist stereotypes about Black people. Kianga Yamada Taylor has observed the following. When it comes to schools, housing, food, and other basic necessities, politicians always complain about deficits and the need to curb spending and cut budgets. The scarcity is manufactured, but the competition over these resources is real. People who are forced to fight over basic necessities are often willing to believe the worst about others to justify why they should have something while others should not. According to several state legislators and the staff, the fight over basic necessities is often expressed in, quote, anti-urban and anti-Philadelphia attitudes, and the common belief that Philadelphia, a majority Black city, receives more than it should. In a conversation I had with Democratic State Representative from Philadelphia, he explained why getting more school funding for Philadelphia, among other issues, was an intractable problem in Harrisburg. the legislator said part of the problem is that there's a very strong, I'll be nice, anti-urban bias. That's an anti-Philadelphia bias. And many people would say, oh, the state tilts and all the money goes into Philadelphia. Well, that's not true at all. And I said, so you had said it's an anti-urban, but especially anti-Philadelphia bias. What are the reasons for that? Well, because we suck all the money out of the state. That's the thinking? No, I'm just saying that's a perception, that we get all the money. That's not true. For example, you talk about school subsidies. We get a school subsidy, but I understand that Philadelphia School District is far larger than most of the districts in the state. And we're the largest district in the state, but the numbers are disproportionate. So when you see the amount of money that the state gives to Philadelphia, it's like, oh, they're getting too much money. But that's reflected in the number of students we have. In fact, Philadelphia was not only the largest school district in Pennsylvania, it educates 12% of all public school students in the entire state. But because of its size, legislators had the impression that Philadelphia received too much money. The state representative suggested that calling it an anti-urban, anti-Philadelphia bias was a, quote, nice way of putting it. In a city and school district with a significant Black population, 42% in the city and 52% in the school district in the year 2021, calling it anti-urban and anti-Philadelphia was a colorblind spin on the anti-Black culture that pervades in the state legislature. Anti-Blackness and anti-big city were two sides of the same coin. According to Business Casual Dan, one strand, he said, is simple, that people don't understand the number, the size. And then the other pieces, just very simply, I think xenophobia, racism. He continued to say, whatever side of the coin you want to focus on, that is whether you choose to be quote unquote nice by chalking it up to state legislators who don't understand the size of Philadelphia, or you focus on the anti-Black subtext of the oops, or you focus on the anti-Black subtext of geography and size, these sentiments were incredibly real, incredibly out front, incredibly blatant all the time, every day, said Dan. To cite an example, he said that in a committee meeting, one of the representatives from Philly will start saying something, and some House members, from the middle of the state will say, why don't we just blow it up? Anti-Black racism circulates rampantly in the state capitol and provides an explanation for why state legislators are so unwilling to create school funding policies that would benefit Philadelphia. This bias is fed by a myth of scarcity which positions Philadelphia as an undeserving competitor in state resources and creates a wedge between underfunded majority white rural districts and majority minority urban school districts that have more in common than they think. But white rural districts have so far been willing to forego systemic change, instead settling for not being at the bottom of the school funding hierarchy. So we've been talking about the role of state legislators in maintaining school racial inequity in school funding. And I now want to focus on school funding campaigns and coalitions. So the fact that members of these campaigns subscribe to colorblind ideologies and actively suppress equity proposals was the single most ethnographically surprising aspect of my fieldwork. So it almost goes against common sense that, that a campaign called Campaign for Fair Education Funding would include members who actively stymied efforts to advance racial equity in school funding. And in doing so, they also contributed to the maintenance of the racial school funding status quo. The policy of hold harmful was hugely controversial and the source of a great deal of conflict among campaign members. The position that campaign members took on this policy was a litmus test on their stance on the role of race in school funding campaigns. The Campaign for Fair Education Funding generally consisted of three types of organizations. The first were grassroots organizers who view racial justice as something that should be central to the work of the campaign and push for the elimination of hold harmful. The second group, all the way to the right, were professional membership-driven associations, commonly referred to as ed associations or unions, that were financially supported by membership dues. The unions were the most vocal supporters of hold harmful, and this was because many of their members who paid the bills would lose out if hold harmful was eliminated. Their financial bottom line dictated their ideological bottom line. And last, there were child and policy advocacy organizations that were somewhere in the middle and can be typified as progressive and equity-minded organizations that practice what I call strategic colorblindness. So they weren't actually colorblind, but they pivoted in whether they talked about race and inequalities depending on their audience and purpose. So their position on hold harmful was somewhere in the middle between the unions and the mobilization organizations. There's definitely been just straight up conflict over that. Sandra Carter, the white executive director of the Pennsylvania Immigration and Citizenship Coalition, or PIC, told me this with unguarded frankness. That referred to the racial justice goals of PIC and other organizing groups, an approach that other members in CFEF, the Campaign for Fair Education Funding, especially the unions, chafed at. PIC as an organization, she said, we really hold up values of racial justice and inclusivity, and that those most impacted should lead the work. Similarly, she described Power as an organization that understands, quote, when we are talking about equity, we're talking about how there's a history of Black communities being underfunded and segregation still exists in our education system. So some of these unions, they just see it as kind of, I paused for Carter to fill in the blank. It's like a budget fight, she responded on cue. She pointedly summarized the differences in the following way. I think there's some people who are like, we need to talk about education funding as part of the history of racial segregation in this country, and we need to acknowledge that to move forward. And some people are like, we just need $4 billion. Let's just get that and we'll be fine. These two framings of the school funding problem, one that focused on racial inequity in school funding, the other on getting more money into the education budget, characterized two different approaches within CFEF. And while these were not mutually exclusive positions, in school funding shorthand, their stances can be typified as a fight for racial equity versus a fight for adequacy. The idea that just increasing state funding will eventually lead to racially fair funding is a common misconception. To those unfamiliar with the minutiae of school funding, including myself before this project, increased school funding for all appears to be a message that we can and should get behind. It seems to telegraph improved school funding conditions for all. But similar to the problem with the slogan, all lives matter, this colorblind all approach to school funding ignores the historic inequities between predominantly white and majority minority school districts. Though the message of increased funding was conveyed as a universal win, in actuality, it gave the whitest school districts the greatest comparative advantage and was a loss for majority minority urban school districts. The straw that broke the campaign's back was Power's nascent public stance in pushing for the elimination of hold harmful. Things came to a boiling point over a series of conference calls in quick succession. One noteworthy call involved a subset of campaign members who were supposed to develop an equity proposal that was a compromise between Power's position of eliminating hold harmful, which was seen as too radical, and the union's position of simply increasing state funding for all. One participant noted that since many of the organizations felt that Power's position on schooling was, quote, not viable, as a middle ground, there was discussion about some sort of acceleration funding that would go to underfunded districts. Reverend Halston, the executive director of Power, one of only two Black-led organizations in the campaign, and Michael Churchill, a white attorney from one of the middle groups, developed a proposal in which 30% of the state's basic education funding would be set aside for underfunded districts. While this proposal did not undo the policy of hold harmful, it was an attempt to move toward leveling the playing field. I talked with one of the members of the campaign who is also one of the few Black women in CFEF. She had to navigate her personal views and her role in the white dominant space of the campaign. She described the call in the following way. One of the unions was like completely opposed to the idea of it being anything more than 10%. And there was like a back and forth, and I was in between meetings and being on my cell phone and just hearing people yelling, and there's construction noise in the background. So people are yelling, and then people are like, I'm just going to hang up. The unions defang the equity supplemented by blocking anything more than 10% of the education budget. The last nail in the CFEF coffin was the infamous conference call, as Sandra Carter characterized it. Although it had been a year and a half between when the call took place and when I interviewed people about it, the people I spoke with remembered the event with striking detail because of the dramatic fashion in which power was kicked out of the campaign. Carter referred to the event as, quote, a really sad story, as well as, quote, the perfect case study of why white-led campaigns result in bad decisions and that actually taking racial justice seriously results in better decision-making. It began with a roll call in which organizations made their position clear. Stop talking about race. Reverend Holston recalled the day with a mix of sadness and astonishment. Publicly, he calls to mind a Black leader from the civil rights era. The cadence of his speeches worked toward a crescendo infused with moral conviction. Interpersonally, he comes across as soft-spoken and deeply contemplative. Recalling the infamous conference call, he said, "The coalition broke up specifically over the issue of race, as power kept saying, we have to lift up the issue of racial justice and expect that our strategies will do that. They came back and said, no, we don't have the bandwidth to talk about race." Lingering on his own words and clearly troubled, he said, "I'll never forget that statement. We don't have the bandwidth to talk about race." Carter also looked back on the event with disbelief. She said, "I've been an organizer for a long time. I've been white my whole life, and it was literally the first time where I heard a series of white people literally say the words, 'Racial justice is a distraction. I think we should move on.'" One by one, 15 or so organizations repeated some version of this on the call. The leaders of the unions had agreed beforehand to dismantle the campaign by having a critical mass of members leave, and one by one, they censured Power's position on racial justice. At the end of the roll call, there was a long moment of silence. Carter punctured the silence by reading a quote from Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. She told me it's, quote, the most confrontational I've ever been. With her heart beating through her chest, she prefaced the quote by saying, "I'm just going to read to you a quote that I feel helps guide my work." The quote from Dr. King is here, and I'll just give you a moment to read it to yourself. All the people I spoke with about the infamous conference call used the word dramatic to characterize Carter's speech. As Carter thought back to that day, she reenacted what happened after the speech and said, "You just did this. You basically just said, we're going to decide when people of color get access to justice, and it's not convenient for me right now, so you all can wait." Under the guise of needing to focus the work of the campaign to avoid distractions and to push for more funding for all school districts, campaign leadership and the unions displaced the issue of racial equity. Racial equity in school funding is so hard to achieve because campaign advocates bury the issue. When adequacy discourses pushed the issue of racial equity in school funding into the margins, as the unions proved effective in doing, the result was the maintenance of this racial school funding gap. So we're just going to do a quick flash forward, which takes us to the infamous year of 2020. And so between where I ended the previous story and where we're going to flash forward to, CFEF became PA Schools Work because, as one advocate said, when you disbrand, you need to rebrand. So by mid 2020, some members of PA Schools Work, fortified by nationwide protests for racial justice, were calling for more explicit language about the disparate impact of school funding on Black and Brown communities. PSEA, the state's teacher union, and PSBA, the school board union, had had enough. Coinciding with the start of the pandemic and the end of the grant cycle, both organizations exited the campaign. By 2021, with 2 of the unions out of the picture, 14 of the more progressive nonprofit organizations in PA Schools Work created a subgroup of partners that focused on a notion of fairness that advanced racial equity. The initiative was called Level Up. Unlike the colorblind strategies that dominated the work of the larger coalition, this subgroup, led by the Education Law Center, was more direct about issues of race, stating that the most underfunded school districts served a disproportionate share of the Commonwealth's students of color, students living in poverty, students with disabilities, and English learners. Power had internal debates about whether to be practical and support initiatives like Level Up that move toward more funding for majority-minority urban districts in need, or to hold firm to their position of 100% fair and full funding. For some power organizers, the stance to abolish racial disparities in school funding was a moral imperative that should not be compromised. For others, refusing to support other strategies that were more in the realm of political possibility, made them irrelevant and put them at odds with potential allies. I chatted with Rochelle about this internal debate on the front porch of her daughter's house. I was dropping off a birthday burrito when Rochelle unexpectedly came to the door. In between talking about our weekend plans, she told me about Power's recent debate about whether to support the governor's 2022 to 2023 budget. She said, people who think, I don't. Rochelle momentarily struggled to find the words to convey her feelings. But then, evoking her mother, the well-respected Philadelphia activist Mamie Nichols, who was referred to in an Inquirer article as being like, quote, a college professor, but not above using an occasional word that cannot be printed in a family newspaper, Rochelle quickly landed on fuck practical. With a characteristic tone in Rochelle's voice that can be detected in 3 generations of Solomons, a voice that I have come to associate with moral clarity and truth-telling, she continued, I'm not concerned about practical. Strategic is different, but practical? No. Fuck practical pointed to how the core problem wasn't a practical one, it was an ontological one, having to do with the project of race-making and the differential valuing of lives. The point was to demonstrate how the state assigned different values to different children's lives through its distribution of school funding. If practical meant working within existing political systems of power and forms of governance, then fuck practical called for a demolition of the current political order and its forms of governance. It was a rejection of the myth of scarcity that tells us to settle for incremental changes. It was a rejection of settling for a little more human. People like Rochelle live by Ella Baker's organizing precept that the reduction of injustice is not the same as freedom. With freedom always on her mind, Rochelle was honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award by the Education Law Center in 2021. Donning a mustard yellow linen shirt and a statement necklace, she accepted the award by reflecting on her life growing up in a working-class Black community in Philadelphia. As Rochelle saw it, her work was informed by her identity as both a teacher and an organizer. She said, the teacher in me deeply believes that learning is transformative. And the organizer in me believes in the capacity of ordinary folk in our schools and communities to define and speak for themselves and persist, resist, and thrive. Rochelle ended with her acceptance speech by interpreting a few lines from the poem, Won't You Celebrate With Me, by Lucille Clifton. Clifton begins the poem with a question. Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? Clifton's urging to celebrate reminds us that you can't sustain struggle with joy and celebration, without joy and celebration. I'll end with the last line of the poem, which for me expresses the ongoing struggle to achieve education equity, along with a dose of humor and drama thrown in. Because in my family, we place a premium on both. Clifton ends with, "Come celebrate with me, that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed." Taking a page out of Rochelle's playbook, I end with a call to celebrate together. Though this system was designed to fail Black and Brown children, every day freedom fighters like Rochelle continue to create the conditions that would make the educational desert bear fruit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Liu, for that presentation, which was absolutely wonderful. We want to invite the audience to ask your questions. You can put them into the chat, or please put them into the chat, as well as any other messages you might have for our speaker. But I would just start by saying, while people are doing that, that I really appreciated finding out, hearing more about Philadelphia, where I once taught, and where kind of the Hornbeck era, and
Yeah.
that it's so relevant today when so many of our municipalities and local governments are still struggling for funding, and states across the country have kind of similar laws, including here in Wisconsin. So thank you for your work. Are there questions out there for our speaker? Well, I think I could, oh, I see a hand up,
Yeah.
maybe. Sorry, my Zoom skills here, but I
So
don't know who's raising it. If you want to unmute,
it's
I think.
John. Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
Yes. Hi. Thank you for a really entertaining and informative presentation. I was just curious about the discussion politically on school funding, or more racial equity funding. Is there much conversation about removing school district funding from property taxes, or is that no longer part of the conversation? And where does that fit into the
Yeah.
current conversation?
Yeah, that is a really important part. Like, so I will just say, that my book really primarily focuses on state funding. And part of the reason for that is, like, I do think that people with even sometimes, like, not necessarily in-depth knowledge of school funding know that local property taxes are oftentimes like a really big part of why there are these huge inequities, right? That these municipalities just have different abilities to tax, residents, or to levy taxes. And so that creates a big part of the problem. And so the book really focuses on the state, because I think the state is supposed to even out some of that unequal local playing field, but the very fact that the thing that's supposed to equal it out is actually racially biased in and of itself was something that I found really interesting and problematic, right? So the book does kind of primarily focus on state funding, but I will say that there were conversations in Pennsylvania around trying to change or maybe disentangle funding from local property taxes because of, I think, the very reasons you're raising. I don't think it got very far. That was the previous administration, right? And I don't think it got very far because I think a lot of times people move to the places that they move, right? If we think about white flight, for those very reasons, because they want to be able to secure certain sources of funding, right? And, well-resourced schools for their own children. And so politically, it's a very, very difficult, difficult proposal to get passed. So, I mean, I think there was some talk when I did field work. There was some talk about that. Like, one of the chief of staff had mentioned it, but it didn't really end up going anywhere. Yeah. But thank you so much for that question.
Great question, and thanks for that answer. Nancy Kendall has a question in the chat, and I'll read it out. Thank you for a remarkable talk and for a beautiful example of how to tell an ethnographic story. To that end, I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you developed the story itself, how you negotiated whose voices to include, how, and to what ends in the story itself.
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think people who read the book and who come to the presentations will know that I have such a high regard for people like Rochelle, I think it comes out, right? Like she really has been kind of like another mother to me. And so I am kind of clear about who I end up aligning myself with, right? And I think that's part of, in some ways, my attempt to do engaged scholarship, which is to think about the power differentials that exist among the people who I'm doing field work with, right? And then to align with people who I think oftentimes don't have as big of a platform for getting their ideas out, right? So that's kind of the decision that I made. But, you know, in truth, I did not, I wouldn't call myself, and I didn't say this in the book because I wanted to make a point that I don't really call myself an active, that this is not activist scholarship, right? Because I think for me, that means that you have to actually subsume whatever the final product is, right? To the feedback that you're getting from your participants. And, you know, I think I was definitely always like kind of in conversation with the people who I did field work with, especially the organizers, right? But the reality of it was that I didn't need, this book had a timeline, right? And I needed it to come out at a certain point, and I wasn't really willing for it to take maybe another 10 years for me to do for me to, if somebody did have like a lot of feedback for me, right, and I needed to change it substantially, like I was not ready to be able to sacrifice that, right? But I think to the extent possible, I did really try to, I think, be in conversation with people well beyond the normal sort of like checks, right? Like at the end when everything is written and you just kind of like give it to them. So much of the book, I feel like, and I said this in the presentation, that Rochelle and others really were really kind of like spiritual guides for me as I wrote the book. And so I feel like so much of the analysis really comes from just ongoing conversations that I had. But with that said, I do feel that there is a need to be, you know, really explicit about like what sacrifices you're willing to make and what you're not, and what you call yourself. Yeah, I really appreciate that question, though. Thank you so much for that.
Great, and we probably have time for maybe one more question from the audience.
Deanna.
Yes, go ahead.
Oh,
Diana, did you have a question?
did we lose her?
Oh, maybe not. Um,
Oh,
oh no, okay.
okay.
Maybe Michael has to do that, or you could put it in the chat.
I was hoping to see you, Deanna.
I would just want to say that you explained some of the intricacies of school funding so well. You mentioned that as a kind of goal
Oh,
at the
good.
onset, and I really admire that in the book. But go ahead,
Okay,
Dion.
good. I'm glad to hear that, because I know for me, I was just like, I'm not. I mean, it may surprise some people to hear that I am not a finance or a state politics person. I don't even like balance my own checkbook. So like this was really a labor of love to
Mm.
understand all this and then to try to translate in ways that like, everyday people could understand.
Well, thank you so much for such a great and inspiring talk. And I'm very glad that Michael unmuted me because this is not a perfect question, so I need to say it. I don't think I'm ready to write it. But what I get from your talk is this sense of a very anti-democratic state.
Mm.
That's, I mean, when I try to figure out the state that you turned into an empirical object, that's my key takeaway. So I would love to hear more from you on how, after all the ethnographic work that you did, how do you conceptualize the state and the
Yeah,
future of educational policy in a place such as Philadelphia?
yeah. I will say I mean, I don't know if I should say this, but I don't think I'll ever do another ethnography on state politics because it was really like I mean, people talk about Philadelphia being like, really mired in like terrible politics, but I did not find that at all to be the case in comparison to state politics. Like the state politics in Pennsylvania kind of infuriates me more. And so I do have a little, okay. So you called it anti-democratic, which it is in a lot of ways. And it is in the sense that there was one woman who worked on gerrymandering, and I interviewed her, and she said that like the House Speaker, basically, like the senior leadership, especially which was like a lot of the last 80 years, really mostly controlled by Republicans, right? That they really sandbagged most equity proposals. Like they just really blocked many proposals, right? There's supposed to be like a process, right? If you like Wikipedia, there's like a process for how to get things proposed, and like it's like I don't know how many, I can't remember exactly how many steps, right? But the speaker and people in senior leadership can kind of short circuit that at whatever point, whether it's to block something or whether it's to propose their own thing, right? And one of the things that she said, and I'm like botching the quote because I don't remember it verbatim, but she basically said that it's like there's like one person out of hundreds of people who are state senators and state representatives who gets to really determine what gets talked about and what policies get even mentioned, right, when it comes to the state legislature. And I think in that sense, it's hugely anti-democratic. It really is, right? That's a big part of the problem. And I think gerrymandering is part of that problem. But the part that I found really interesting was also the way in which they mobilize democracy as a way of blocking equity, right? So like Representative Overland, I really think that a lot of the state legislators, including some of the people who I talked to, Republicans, felt like, well, this is what representative democracy looks like. I am supposed to support my own constituents' needs, right? And so that's what I'm doing, right? And they felt like they were, they were doing good. They were doing what they were hired, right? They were elected to do. And so so it's kind of interesting, right? It is hugely anti-democratic in some senses, right? And then in others, right, I think some of the state legislators would argue that they were just doing what they have been elected to do. But I do really appreciate that question. I think it's like, I think it really kind of gets at the heart of some of the things that I wanted to talk about in the book, which was like why is it that we continue in 2024 to deal with these issues, right? And I think it does have to do with a lot of these kind of like quote unquote democratic structures that exist, right? But don't really always work in the service of equity. Thank you.
Thank you. Great question. Maybe I can ask one last one, which is just what role do you think ethnography or qualitative research can play in school funding?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So I think for me, what I try to do, and I think other people, I would love for there to be more ethnographies on school funding, because I think one of the big things that I realized when I started embarking on this project was like, there is so much written about school funding from like an economic perspective, right? Which makes sense, right? It makes sense. But I think what's oftentimes missing, right, like I said, is the story behind the numbers, right? Especially the questions that have to do with like how and why these things persist today, right? Why we continue to see these inequities persisting today. And I do think those kinds of questions can only be answered through ethnography, right? And through kind of some long-term research agenda that tries to get at things that are behind the scenes, right? Like kind of, one of the things that the book reviewers said about my book was it's like, trying to look at how the sausage gets made. And that is really, what I tried to do in the book. And I would love for there to be other books. Matthew Kelly from Penn State also wrote a history book on school funding, which I really appreciate, because I do think that to have a better grasp of what's happening and the state of school funding and inequities, we need more than economic research, right? We also need like history and, ethnographies of this, because, what I really tried to do, which another book reviewer had compared the book to Karen Ho's Liquidated, right? That looks at what Karen Ho looked at with like Wall Street people, but it's trying to kind of like quote unquote study up, right? To see how it is, like what are the machinations of how these proposals consistently get stymied or blockaded. But I will say also that one kind of bright note has been that this past year, there were various things that like really came to fruition, including like and I talked a little bit about this at the end, but this kind of rearranging of some of the advocacy groups and coalitions, right? Such that there was like a school funding lawsuit. The decision was victorious, right? So like a landmark decision. And the political composition of the state legislature also changed, right? So there's like a Democratic governor, Democratic House of Rep, and also like the advocates, I think really sort of like changed some of their strategies. And because of all those things, right, there was a really historic $1 billion increase in state education funding. There are problems with it, but I think that does sort of at least point to some hopefulness in the ways that people are, advocating for these things. And I think it's the role of ethnography to try to capture all of that variation, right? And kind of like how things happen, not just that they happen, right? But like how it happens and how it unfolds.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Thanks so much for this talk. We're at our witching hour. Thanks to everyone who joined us. And you can find the link to the book in the chat. So thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
so much.
Have a good
Thank you
day,
for the
everyone, and have a
invitation.
good
Appreciate
weekend.
it.